Imagine, if you would, a story-driven video game where you don't have direct control over the character you play as. Instead of a set amount of actions you use in order to find success, you are left to be an observer of the story at hand. Sounds like a weird kind of game, right? Well, what if I told you that you don't have to imagine such a game? What if I said there's two games where you play as the observer, yet still have the ability to determine your fate in the story at hand, just in a different way? What games are these, you may ask? Well, in this episode of Cartridges and Consoles, I'll introduce you to these two games, where the only way to change the outcome of the story is to change the order of which the story's events happen. Welcome to the Framed Collection. Framed Framed is a multi-award-winning puzzle game that was developed by Love Shack. Not that Love Shack. And first released for mobile phones in 2014. A sequel to the game, Framed 2, released 3 years later in 2017, with a Steam and Nintendo Switch port of both games releasing the next year as the Framed Collection. While all the footage you see here is from the Nintendo Switch version of the Framed Collection, all three versions of the game are relatively the same, minus some UI and mild control changes. The story of Framed involves a morally ambiguous man and woman trying to get away from the police for a seemingly unexplained reason. The primary way you control these characters and their fate is not by controlling them directly, rather by changing around the panels of a comic book to alter the outcome of the sequence. This can involve moving the panels around so they happen at different times, rotating the panels to change their orientation and perspective, or even having to move panels to reappear in the story multiple times. As you go through the entirety of this story, you'll rearrange the panels to find the solution that drives everything forward, and discover all the twists and turns that await you behind every page. The sequel, Frame 2, is relatively the same as the first. However, the game is a prequel, with the story taking place before the first games, and the puzzles you encounter are more difficult and creative, with new obstacles being added to panels you use, and the inclusion of new puzzles requiring different types of visual clues to solve. Now, as apparent from the description, the mechanic of these games is a very simple one to learn, which is one benefit of the Framed Collection. No matter which of the games you start with, you'll get a very simple introduction to the concept of moving comic book panels. Though with the first one, the multiple different ways to move the panels are gradually introduced, while with the second one, all the basics are relatively covered by the fifth puzzle. The games can also come off as relatively short. Depending on how stuck you get on some puzzles, you can finish both Framed 1 and 2 within an average of 2 hours, meaning if you're looking for short games, these are definitely your type. One of the two biggest factors helping benefit both games, however, is the overall art style. Of course, with the game revolving around the idea of changing comic book panels, the entire game looks and feels like a comic book or graphic novel, helping submerge you into this world. Additionally, every panel contains hand-drawn animation that takes heavy inspiration from that of film noir, with every person and almost every important object being cloaked in a black silhouette, minus some clothing items or facial features. To contrast this, there's a lot of colorful backgrounds and even some flashy neon lights that stand out and contribute a lot to a world that would be very drab otherwise. The sound design is also exceptional, with a soundtrack filled to the brim with catchy smooth jazz, and even the sound effects being done with actual instruments, with some examples being snare drums resembling gunshots, cymbals resembling windows or glass breaking, and even dog barks being made from low-pitched string instruments. This art style, of which is uncommon for a noir-style game, is one that enriches you into the environment of the story, and makes you feel more part of the action. Speaking of being part of the action, even though the gameplay doesn't have you directly engaging with the world, it is still simple and incredibly enticing, making it the second biggest positive factor. The centralized mechanic is a concept that was never really done before, not having any direct actions you yourself can perform, rather instead having the player play with the context the action happens in. Yet, the developers hit it out of the park here. They made 2 games that are mostly watching a scene play out feel like anything but, by making the player think about how the story will play out when arranging the comic book panels. This also helps make the experience less so about only getting the correct solution, as getting the incorrect solution makes you think more about the puzzle at hand and allows you to experiment with different methods. It's this essence of gameplay that drags you into the story more than it really should, and contributes to a unique feeling other games can't do as easily. To drive home the fact that these 2 factors are the biggest positive attributes, both the visual style and gameplay are cited as reasons for why Hideo Kojima, the creator of some of the biggest video games of all time, such as the Metal Gear Solid series and Death Stranding, called Framed his Game of the Year in 2014. The captivating stories and narratives of both games also add so much here. Even though we know nothing about the main characters other than their roles, their silhouettes, and sometimes their eyes, they still are able to be very prevalent and engaging figures in these captivating stories. Plus, both plotlines take unexpected turns that you typically wouldn't see coming, adding onto already brilliantly written games and making the story stand out that much. The only negative I can pinpoint about the game has to do with the controller support with the Nintendo Switch version. Obviously, porting a video game originally designed exclusively for mobile phones to consoles has a very slim chance of going over smoothly, and the Frame Collection is sadly a culprit of this. With the Nintendo Switch version, Love Shack added intuitive tactile controls exclusively for it, and while these controls are not the worst, you can clearly tell they were not the intended way this game was meant to be played. However, this is really just a small nitpick with only the Nintendo Switch version of the game, and this control scheme can be completely negated if you play the game in handheld mode and make use of a Nintendo Switch's touchscreen instead. In summary, the Frame Collection contains 2 wonderful puzzle games that flip everything you know about controlling the lead character on its head, yet still deliver on that aspect and more. The concept of these games was and still is unique, and while on paper it may seem like a quirky choice that may not work, the result was quite the contrary, with it being an enticing mechanic that makes the experience better overall. In addition to this mechanic, both games are filled with well-written storylines and a masterclass art style that make them pieces of work that are not only visually and audibly pleasing to play, but also fun to enrich yourself into. Whether you're a fan of puzzle games, film noir, interesting mechanics, all 3, or even none of the above, both of these games are ones you must try out for yourself. They truly go down as some of the best games in history. Framed 1 and 2, as part of the Framed Collection, get my rating of 10 out of 10 golden cartridges.